Today we're going to look at Google App Engine. It's the Google Cloud Platform as a Service. Its competitor may be something like Heroku, but the idea it's extremely scalable. It's a managed serverless platform, meaning you don't have to worry about servers and scaling or any configuration outside of what you put in a simple configuration file. You can use many different programming languages, typically languages that are used to write distributed systems and web apps. You basically write your code as you normally would, and you only pay for code that is getting accessed. So the idea is that as long as your system is sitting there idle, you're not paying for it. It's not costing you anything. But as users come to your website or your application and start using it, of course, you're charged for what you use, but then they also scale the app accordingly. So that's the key idea, is that me as an app developer, I don't have to worry about scaling. I don't have to worry about a server. I can deploy my app very simply to Google App Engine, and it just works. So to get started with Google App Engine, as with any Google Cloud product, there's typically going to be a simple quick start. And so we see that there's quick starts for multiple languages: Python, Java, PHP, Ruby, Go, Node.js. We follow this quick start, and it's really all that we need for the simple application that we're developing. And so the idea is that we start by downloading the Google Cloud SDK on our local machine. One thing that I do want to point out and make sure that everybody is aware of is that we don't have to go through the process, and no matter whether we're installing this Google Cloud SDK, or if we need Java or Python or some other programming language, framework, or any application really to run on our machine. The idea is that instead of using this point and click method and downloading applications repeatedly to our machine, we can actually use a package manager. The idea is that if you're installing software, and we've been talking about configuration management and how we need to manage our server configs and even serverless configs using a configuration file, we can basically do the same thing for our local machines if we use package managers to install all the applications that we need to install. If you're coming from a Linux environment, that's typically the way it's done by default, whether it's Arch Linux and Pacman or Ubuntu or some Debian distribution that uses apt. We can programmatically install software using the command line, as well as other install scripts to basically set up systems automatically. And so there's Homebrew. So if you have a Mac, I certainly encourage you to install Homebrew. It's the kind of primary package manager for Macs and OS and Mac OS. For Ubuntu, there's apt. For Windows users, there's Chocolatey, the package manager for Windows. Again, we install Chocolatey once, and then now we can script all of our other applications that need to be installed every time we set up a new Windows machine or restore our operating system, etc. So I certainly encourage you to use package managers and use a package manager even to install this Google Cloud SDK. So that's the end of that digression. Now that we have our system installed, we can go in and actually run the application. And so I do have gcloud installed. The very first command that it gives you is just gcloud components update. And of course, my system has been recently updated, so there's nothing to update. But now, at the very least, I know that the Google Cloud SDK has successfully been installed on my machine. These other commands allow you to create new projects. Of course, you could always go to the console to create a new project as well. And so you can come here and say new project and create a new project for your use. And once you create a project, that's basically the doorway into all the different Google Cloud services, whether it be App Engine, Compute Engine, BigQuery, any of the SQL databases, or even Firestore and Firebase projects can be managed via this Google Cloud Platform project. So the next step is we can describe our current project. If we do have a project that we're currently using, let's go ahead and try that command. So I do have a project, software test for CD, and again, it gives you information about that particular project. And one of the key pieces here is just a project ID. You'll use this several different times as part of your deployment, so it's always good to know exactly what that project ID is. If not, I could create the project. Enable billing. Again, I provided credits to all students. So if you need to apply those credits, you have instructions to do so. You can enable billing in order to use App Engine. You need Git installed. And then finally, you need to run this command to actually install App Engine for your chosen programming language. And so again, mine is Go. And again, I want to say that this command has already been installed on my machine. We can also proceed from there and say, now let's clone a set of a repo that has lots of different examples. Again, these examples are good to basically give us ideas as to how we can use App Engine and how we can configure it for specific needs. There is the Hello World, very simple application where you can basically deploy a Go app, and that Go app responds to an HTTP request and sends back hello Google App Engine or hello world or something like that. But then, basically that's the hello world version of this Google App Engine deployment. But the key that I wanted to show you here is that it really takes one command, this Google App Deploy, to deploy your system to Google App Engine and allow the world to access it. After you deploy, you'll be provided a link where you can actually access the app or the root of the app, or you can enter this command to open that deployed app in a browser. And so I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like. This application I'm writing as part of our professional practice project. And so what we have here is basically my version of an API to manage accounts. Right now I have about 4 different endpoints or 5 different endpoints. Home endpoint, an endpoint that allows you to add an account, to transfer funds between accounts, to list all the accounts for a particular client or customer, and then and basically 2 different ways of getting at all the accounts for a customer, either by entering a URL parameter or by posting JSON. And so this very simple app, I can run it locally. I'll run it here. With that command, I'll build it, at least the latest version, and I'll run it. And then I can use Postman to access the endpoints locally. And so now that I have Postman running, I just want to show you that yes, I can get to these routes locally. And so I do have some data in Firestore for this particular app. I can send that request. And of course, there's some accounts that I created for this particular client. I can come here and again see my home route where I'm just listing that it's the accounts API. I can actually create a new account. I think I already have an example. Let's just say client number 3. He's going to create a checking account and he has, let's say, $100,000 in his account and it is active. And so locally, I am able to create this account. And one other thing about this setup is that I have actually 2 different Firestore databases that I'll use for this project. So we talked about our deployment pipelines and the need to have a deployment pipeline where we can actually deploy or we can start by testing our applications in a local test environment. Again, we can set those environments up many different ways. We've used Vagrant as well as Docker. But then the next level of testing is actually to have a staging environment. And so with Cloud Firestore, the database that I'm choosing to use for this project, I cannot actually run a local version of it. There is a Firestore emulator, but currently there's some workarounds to make it work with Go, but it hasn't been deployed officially with Go. So I'm just created a separate project that basically contains a staging Firestore database that I'm using and I can test locally. So all that data that we just looked at is in a staging version of a real production Firestore database, but it's called software testing staging. I do have a production database where we can add some more data to and actually test what that looks like once I deploy it to Firestore. And so one of the things that we also talked about last week is this idea of a 12-factor app. And one of the important pieces of making your app in line with the 12-factor guidelines is that you have to get your configuration from your environment. And so one of the things that allows us to do is have different configuration settings depending on where we're actually running the app. I have potentially a testing configuration that I can run locally, a staging configuration that I can run in a remote staging environment, and then of course a production configuration. I am using a tool that was made popular in Ruby, go.env. This .env tool, basically there's a .env tool for just about any language out there. And so the idea with this tool is that you can create a .env file or a .env test or a .env production or whatever, and it reads these .env files as if it was reading these details directly from your environment. So I use this primarily in development where I can set an environment, I can set my service account, which I'll show you as a way of accessing the Cloud Firestore instance. And then I can also define what my project ID is. And actually this should be software staging here since I am using my staging environment as opposed to my official, production environment. So again, these two now match. We can think about now what the next steps are because we know at the very least that my app is working locally. And so I'm satisfied if I had, unit tests running for this app, I can run my unit and integration tests. But now where I am, I'm satisfied that the app is running locally. And if I'm ready to push it to production, then what I need is number one, an app.yaml file. There's only one required line, that's this runtime line. And so the idea with this runtime line, it just specifies the version of the runtime that you want to deploy. So here I'm deploying Go version 1.13. And so that's the only thing that's really needed for this file. I do also specify some environment variables to let my app know that it's running in production once I do so. This is actually my production environment. So when I deploy this to App Engine, I'm actually deploying it to a production environment. I could also have multiple app.yaml files, and I can deploy and specify a particular file where maybe I do have a staging App Engine environment, even though that's not necessarily needed, but I could if I wanted to. But the idea with App Engine is that you can actually direct traffic to any version of your app. You can add an additional flag to your deployment command so that you don't promote the use of this deployment. So basically you say no promote and it won't send any traffic to that deployment, but you can always go and access that deployment as if it were running in a staging environment. So now that I have this app.yaml file, I can actually deploy this code. So now I'm going to enter the command to deploy this application in my terminal, gcloud app deploy. Yes, I do want to continue. It's going to go through the process of course, building my app, determining which files need to be deployed. There's a differencing engine in there that is only going to copy files that change between deployments. And then, of course, at some point in the production environment, it's going to build the app and download all of the necessary packages. Again, Go package management system, or at least the current latest one, is this Go mod file. And so no matter whether you're deploying Go or Python with a requirements.txt or Node.js with package.json, you have to specify the libraries that your app is going to need so that when that production environment is being built, basically its own container is being built, you can download the necessary library files at their respective versions that you know are working for your app, and we know that they'll work the exact same way in production. And so this typically takes a few minutes maybe before you actually have a link to access. That deployment took approximately 2 minutes and 11 seconds. And so now I can come here. So one of the outputs to standard out from that deployment is the actual service link. And so I can come here and click on that link. And of course, I get my accounts API. If I wanted to further test this with Postman, then I could start by checking to see what data is there. So instead of localhost, I'll copy that link to Postman and see what accounts exist for client number 2. No accounts are available for that client. The other thing that I can do is go to my production server database to see exactly what's in my server database. And I can click on Cloud Firestore. and view all the content. So I have several different accounts there that I created. It seems like this client new has several accounts, and then client ID 1234 has a couple. And so if I go back to Postman, I can actually ping those requests. So let's start with client new. So yes, I can see his accounts. I can also add new accounts. Let's see. So if I come here, instead of going locally, I can go remotely and add an account for, say, client number 1, a checking account. Come to my database, and let's see which one of these was number 1. This is the new account that was added. Again, Firestore gives you a default ID that you can also use as part of your data set. These other fields were fields that I decided I needed to represent an account. And so there, now I have my app deployed to Firestore, and now I have my app deployed to App Engine, and the Firestore database is accessible remotely. So if this was my production app, I would access it at this link. And again, I can, basically, use my app as needed in production, even though it's a very small app that's not quite finished in terms of what I'm going to use it for. But I know that it's working in production via Google App Engine, and all I had to do is issue one command to release this to production. A couple other things that will be interesting about App Engine is that, of course, now that I know that I have this app running in production, I have to be able to manage it. And so I can come here and manage the versions of my app. If I did make a change to the app that I wanted to deploy to, say, a staging environment, one of the things that I could do is to deploy the app gcloud app deploy. Well, let's make a change first. Actually, let's just change our root response, and I'm going to call this Google App Engine Accounts API. I'll save that. And then I'm going to deploy with this, I want to say no promote flag. And so what that flag is going to do is going to allow me to deploy my app, but it's not going to make it accessible to any users. And so to manage the app, I can come here and I can see all the different versions, and I can see that 100% of the traffic is going to my latest version of the app. I will have a newer version of the app where I get 0% of the traffic, but I can always go to that particular version. As you see here, if I wanted to go back to a prior version, I can actually see what's available at a prior version by accessing this link. And so that's one of the things about, managing our configuration, because we can easily roll back. If there's any problems that occur with our development process, we can always roll back to a specific version that we know was actually working. But in order to deploy an app to staging, basically I'll go through the process of deploying the app with the no promote flag. After some time, that app will be deployed, and then I can go and smoke test or exploratorily test that application running in production, where I know that there won't be any traffic directed to that application until I come here and actually say, yes, now I want 100% of my traffic to go to some specific version. And so those are some of the benefits that Google App Engine gives you. On this dashboard, you can see all the different routes that have been accessed. And then there's also a way to view logs for each of those different routes. You can click on the route and go to the Log Explorer, and you can basically see all the logs in real time, or you can go and see logs from prior periods. So now that that app has been deployed, instead of me seeing or the output being the standard link, I'm given a link that's specifically for that deployment. And so if I click on that link, I can see the most updated version of my app. But this will be the link that all of my customers see. And again, it's the prior version. I can log into App Engine, and actually, let's just go back and then promote all new traffic to whichever instance that I want to promote to. So let's refresh that one. And now that I have a newer version, even though 100% of the traffic is going to the prior version, I can come here and then now promote all traffic to this version as opposed to the previous version. So if I click on versions, I can select the latest resource, the time that it was deployed, and I can migrate traffic to that version. So again, here is my prior version. Then this is my root link, prior version, just plain old accounts API. And now I can promote and migrate traffic to a newer version. Yes, go ahead and migrate. And of course, eventually I'll have 100% of the traffic to the newer version, or I could choose to split traffic. And so we'll get into the idea of doing A/B testing, where we might choose a smaller percentage of our user base to use a different version of the app so that we can collect data to measure whatever quality we're trying to determine. And one way that we can do that is using this split traffic, where I could send 10% to say some new version and then collect data on that 10%, collect test data on that 10%, and determine whether or not that was a good idea. And then of course, eventually promote that newer version to 100% of my user base. So that's it. That video was a bit longer than I anticipated, but this is Google App Engine. The final thing that I wanted to look at is this Logs Explorer. The idea is that any output to standard out from your program is going to be stored here, in addition to some additional logs that App Engine stores and tracks will all be available here. And so we can see whether or not we have some issues. So I'm missing a favicon, and so I'm getting a 404 every time it tries to pull that favicon. But any output, for example, that I write to standard out is going to be shown here. Any errors, etc., as well as any log or debug type messages that exist. So especially for testing purposes, these things are important to see exactly what's going on. But then you, of course, want to clean those logs up to make sure you're not leaking any unnecessary data. But again, another useful feature, because even in production, I can actually monitor and view the status of my app and see exactly what's going on and why certain errors have occurred. So that's it for App Engine. We have covered enough to get your PPA number 2 apps deployed. Thanks.